By way of reminder, half the final exam will be these last two chapters. We'll start chapter 13 today. Yeah, all right. The Middle Ages Europe was largely rural, that is, it's countryside. We're talking about countryside. My wife has a lot of relatives who are farmers in South Georgia. And that part of the country is rural. And then you have urban. Both are important. The rural people grow the crops that we eat, and folk, a big price is going to be when the present generation of farmers all retire or die off, who's going to become farmers? Because the new generation of Americans do not want to farm. Also, it's a very difficult way to make money. But anyway, you have your rural, and then your urban. You have to have urban people. A lot of big cities, in order to make things like railroads, airplanes, automobiles, and whatever. They did not know that at the time, but the trend toward urbanization is looked on as being a sign of progress. When people move from the country to the city, and more, as recently as 1860 in our country, half the people in our country were farmers. By now, less than 1 person in 20 in this country is a farmer. 5%. The other 95% are not farmers. As they moved to the cities, they set up businesses. Among the businesses were tanning of hides to make leather, and they would set up blacksmith shops, shoe cobbler shops. The leather was used often to make shoes. And to protect each other and to protect themselves, they set up guilds. One of the purposes of the guilds was to guarantee a quality product. In order to be a member of a guild, you had to prove that you could make a product that came up to a certain quality, to a certain level. And then once that guild put its stamp of approval on your product, that told the customer that this is a quality product. For instance, if a cobbler wanted to join a guild, he had to prove that he could make a really good pair of shoes. And the guild would stamp its approval. The guilds were similar to unions that came later. But they also protected against competition. They didn't want competition because competition can put you out of business, and we're learning that the hard way. A store that's been around for all my life, all my grandfather's life, my father's name Sears, is going under. General Motors is suffering from competition and might go under. On a personal note, my daddy worked for General Motors for 20 years, so I can get a discount on a GM car. I did that one time, and it was the worst new car I ever bought. Oh. I have not bought a GM car, General Motors car since. That was a Chevy van, and its engine did not even last 100,000 miles. All right, that's the personal. Of course, GM's management later apologized for making a crummy car, and they started making them a little bit better, but they're making big news. But anyway, the guilds helped to guarantee that there'd be no competition. They didn't want competition. They wanted security. And the guilds somewhat provided for that purpose. So it worked both ways, a good quality product. You'd start out, you start at the bottom if you want to, right, you start as an apprentice. An apprentice was an unpaid helper. You'd go from apprentice to journeyman, and from there to master. An apprentice was usually maybe a 10-year-old boy from the time you were 10 to 17. At 17 or thereabouts, you become a journeyman. A journeyman meant you were a paid helper working under a master. Then when you got to be really good at your craft, you become a master maybe at 25 or 30. And as a master, you train the apprentices and journeymen, and you would set up business for yourself. And also, only the masters were allowed to join a guild. A series of fairs were set up. The most famous fair being the fair set up by the Count of Champagne. The fair began about this time, and is still going on. In fact, my wife and I went to a fair just last September at Cobb County.
Like a fair?
Fair, yeah, fairs where you'd bring your wares. In other words, people would get together, buyers and sellers would get together and meet. They would exchange their wares. And of course, people would bring their cattle, their pigs, their chickens, and whatever the fairs. The cobbler would bring his shoes to the fair. The tanner would bring his hides to the fair, and the hides he had tanned. And the horseshoe, the smith would bring his horseshoes, things like that.
Oh, I'm confused. Is a fair like a swap meet?
Like what?
Like a swap meet?
It was a swap fest, yeah. I mean, that's to this day there's still swap fest a lot.
Yeah, that's what I'm
You go to a
saying.
fair and you'll see. Of course, people don't buy camels at fairs these days.
Yeah,
like
but-
that. But you'll see camels and you'll see exotic animals. It was a showcase. And anyway, they set up fairs in which they exchange goods.
So like, not like a fair, like.
Also at the fairs, all kinds of.
Like it's a different.
Okay, listen, please. All right, at fairs, all kinds of vices went on, and priests would say that they had a lot of business. When the fair was over, people would come to them to confess sins that they'd committed during the fair. Mostly sex and excessive drinking, but a lot of drinking went on at these fairs also. All right, they would hold the fairs 6 times a year, not just once a year, but about. Pardon me. They had annual affairs. Annual fairs that were held. Now the church. The head of the church was the Pope. He had duties that often he had secular duties. In other words, if you study in detail, the popes of the Middle Ages, they acted a lot like secular princes. They made treaties. They fielded armies. They took up military campaigns and sometimes even led the armies themselves. And in 1870, all these secular affairs were taken away with when the Pope's domains were taken from him, and the Pope became a spiritual head and not a secular head. But in those days, the Pope had an area around Rome called the Papal States, where he was a secular ruler as well as a spiritual head. The feudal system also got into the church. In other words, to become a bishop, you had to be of noble birth. In practically every case, this was true. To become an archbishop, you had to be of even higher noble birth. Eventually, the office of cardinal was created, and only the people of really high birth got to be cardinal. Now, folks, there was always, and one of the exceptions, there was one case where a very, very smart man who was born into poverty, born a peasant, became Pope, but Pope Sylvester V by name. But this was very rare. Now, yeah, don't worry about the name. I'm not going to write it down. But there was a case where a man born into poverty rose all the way through the ranks because people around him recognized his brilliance. Now, there were some problems. One of the big issues was who chose the church officials. And much too often, the king or the Lord chose the officials. I've already mentioned how that King Henry II appointed Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury. Well, along came a pope who said, hey, the church should appoint its own officials. By today's standards, he was right. Pope Gregory VII said that the church should appoint its own officials. And this led to some conflicts because a lot of the local lords, the secular rulers, were appointing church officials. And this was to lead to a conflict that was to last for a couple hundred years. Anyway, Pope Gregory was the pope who opposed Henry IV. I talked about him. He was the Holy Roman Emperor who insisted that no, Henry, was to appoint church officials. The Pope said, no, I'm going to appoint them. And Henry was put under interdict. It meant his realm, during the time that he was under interdict, everybody who died went to hell. And there could be no marriages performed, no sacraments performed, no extreme unctions performed. Anyway, Henry had to acquiesce and give in. And this round went to the church. Eventually, an agreement was reached Now this looks like Concordant of Worms. Pardon me, folks, it's Worms. It's spelled with a W. Anybody who knows anything at all about German knows what the Concordant of Worms, spelled W, yes. It said that the church appointed its own officials, but the Lord had to approve. So it was a compromise. Now today, the church appoints its own officials without approval of the nobility or without approval of the local governments. The church appoints the officials. But the Concordant of Worms was a compromise where the church would appoint the officials, and then the Lord's either approved or disapproved. If the Lord did not approve, then they'd send somebody else to see if the Lord would approve of that one.
So what did Henry
Henry the Fourth, he was the one who had to bow down and acquiesce to the Pope, and because he clashed with the Pope. He went to the Alps mountains where the Pope had a winter home and walked barefoot in the snow for 4 days at a place called Canossa. Don't worry about the name Canossa, but and Henry had to finally acquiesce. The Pope had to take him into the church because he was repentant, and the Pope, being a religious figure, had to forgive a person who showed true repentance. Also at this time there was a monastic movement, a new, a new order of monks came along called the Dominicans, after St. Dominic. Like the other orders, they took the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Dominican friars were, among other things, they were missionaries going around to the unconverted to try to convert the unconverted, and they also attempted to help the poor. St. Dominic began the Dominican order of monks. The Dominican order of monks, by the way, still exists to this day. Now, they did more than that, though, unfortunately, and folk, I have to mention this because it is part of the story. While it sounds like that St. Dominic was really good, one of the things, though, that he did was get involved in the Inquisition. The Inquisition is truly a black mark in church history. The Inquisition was where that the church would use torture or executions to bring heretics back into line. A heretic was anyone who disagreed with the church doctrine or who did not join the church. And multiplied, hundreds of thousands of people were killed over a period of several hundred years, actually. Beginning around from the 500s until about 1000, there was no persecution. Then, beginning about 1000, a bunch of heresy movements started. Most of them started in southern France, with groups like the Lollards, the Albigensians, and the Cathars. Don't worry about those names, but these groups disagreed with the church on a lot of matters. So the church set up the Inquisition to bring them back into line, and the Inquisition killed a lot of folk. Now, I have a book at home. It was one of my dad's textbooks when my dad was in college. The book was written in the 1920s. And this book says that not one of the popes have ever apologized for the Inquisition. However, since that book was written, Pope John Paul II made something that might be an apology, or might be considered an apology, for the Inquisition. But it is a black mark in church history. I sometimes wonder if I should give my own personal opinions or not. I mean, my wife and I had to talk about that yesterday, but personally, though, a lot of the heresies that went on at this time, if I had been alive then, well, of course, I'm speaking with a 21st century mind, but they were worse than any. In other words, they were the type of heresies that I could not join. A lot of them would say that sex was evil, that persons should not marry, or if a person's married, they should only be married for a few years and then drop out of their marriage, and because, again, this was the will of God. And basically, by any reasonable standard, they were worse than the Catholic Church ever got. I mean, and I don't mean to sound like I'm knocking the Catholic Church, but most of the heresies had some real serious issues and some real serious problems. Nevertheless, persecution was not the solution. The solution was let these heresies go their merry way, and after a while the rest of us would see that they were wrong and adopt something else. So, but now, again, if any of you want to comment, I mean, your input is welcome. If any of you know anything at all about the topic I'm talking about. But heresy was beginning to be a problem with the church beginning around the year 1000, and it culminated in the early 1500s with the Protestant Reformation, which is really a topic for second semester world history rather than first semester. Now, into this scenario stepped the most powerful pope of all time, Pope Innocent III. Innocent III, in person, he was a little man and very unassuming looking. And it has been said that inside of Rome itself and the area around Rome, he got no respect. But outside of Rome, he was looked on as being God's representative on earth. I mean, he was really like on the top of the world. He told all of Europe's kings what they could and could not do. For instance, King Philip Augustus, the most powerful king of France, actually the most powerful king in Europe, decided one day to divorce his wife. Innocent III heard about it and told him, no, you may not divorce your wife. Divorce is against God's will. You must take your wife back. Again, I mean, I have to agree with Innocent III that divorce is probably not God's will, but on the other hand, he should not have had the power to tell the king what to do. He should have maybe been the king's conscience and suggested that, hey, what you're doing is wrong. I mean, I don't disagree with it, but to have the power to order the king to take back his wife, again, this is something that today's popes cannot do, and along the way they lost that power. But nevertheless, Innocent III, King John also opposed Innocent III. King John of England, and he and Innocent had a few rounds in which John could not win. Now, in order to get money, rather than depend on free will offerings, he sold indulgencies. And folk, I can never talk about indulgencies without blushing a little bit. In a minute or so you'll know why. Essentially, an indulgency was where you'd purchase forgiveness of sin. Now, if you felt like committing a certain sin, you'd go to the priest and you'd tell the priest what sin you wanted to commit. You and the priest would haggle over the price. Now, the more money you had, the more you'd have to pay. And the bigger the sin you wanted to commit, the more money the priest got out of it. And then the priest would write you out a bill of forgiveness and indulgence. You'd pay the priest, and then you'd go out and at least try to commit the sin you had just purchased forgiveness for. Now, folk, this went on for some time. The sale of indulgences lasted for about 400 years. St. Peter's, which still stands today, was built from the sale of indulgences, but the Catholic Church no longer sells indulgences.
They don't?
No. I just had one student act like he was disappointed. They don't. Here's the problem with it. No, here's the problem. The sale of indulgences bumped head first into a certain individual one day. Anybody know what man I'm talking about? A certain man slapped him hard down, and the sale of indulgences was never quite the same. Eventually it was stopped. It became embarrassment to the church. The man's name was Martin Luther. Martin Luther, you might have heard of him. Hopefully you'll study him when you... But Martin Luther spoke hard against them. And of course I had a student, I mean, did the sale of indulgence mean you could get forgiveness from a secular authority? I said, no, it did not mean. I mean, you could, if you stole something and the secular authorities caught you, you'd have to pay for your crime. Or if you murdered, you'd probably hang for your crime. Again, the secular, but it guaranteed you forgiveness. Yes.
Well, I went to Catholic Church, and you put the money in, and you light a candle, and you pray it off. That's a forgiveness.
That's not an indulgence.
That's not an indulgency. An indulgence was where you wanted to commit a specific sin.
That's called a votive candle. I went to Catholic school for 12 years.
Okay.
So you could go in and light this candle, and then you would say a prayer and beg or pray for forgiveness. But it was a donation for the candle.
So when you go to the priest in the booth, what is that?
That's confession.
Yes, but
Yeah, that's the
it's
confession.
But you don't
forgiveness.
sign a check there. You don't hand over any
Same
money.
thing, just different, no money.
Well,
okay.
no, actually it's not, because
Yeah.
if you don't mind. confession is a sacrament in the Catholic Church, and only a priest can give forgiveness. So you have to go through the ritual, and then you have to do a penance. It's not, you're going to do the votive candle, and praying for forgiveness is voluntary. When you go to confession, it's a sacrament that can only forgiveness can be granted by that priest.
So, I have a question for both of you guys. So when you go to confession, does it matter the sin?
No, it just depends. Actually, it does be, if you commit murder and you confess it, technically the priest can't report you because it's
Yeah.
that priest parishioner confidentiality. However, he will encourage you to turn yourself in.
Just no money.
And then he, I don't know if since I've never committed a murder and never gone to confession to confess it, I don't know what would happen, but there is that legal bond between the confessor and the confessee.
Okay.
Yeah.
No
And
money
then-
exchanges.
That makes it sound like you did murder someone and just didn't confess it.
No, I have not.
And then.
Okay, listen, we got to
Yeah,
move
we're
on,
going
folks.
off
We got to
tangent
move
here.
on.
No, I
Yeah.
have a question about what you were talking about.
What's that?
What you were talking about, Martin Luther.
Yeah, Martin Luther came much later now.
So if you, like, okay, so let's say you wanted to go out to a party and excessively drink, because you said that was
Yeah.
the sin back then. And you would have to, like, that's a specific sin you would ask them.
You could go to a priest and confess that sin and be forgiven.
So you wouldn't pay for it.
You would not pay for it. Today, in today's world, you don't pay for it.
No, but back then.
But that back then, the indulgence is where you would get the forgiveness before you commit the sin, to make sure you're covered.
So what's the indulgency for?
Raising money to get yourself or a loved one, to get a loved one out of purgatory. In other words, the indulgence was also used to get your relatives and friends out of purgatory also.
Buying your way out of here.
Yeah, buy your way out. All right. Okay, we've got to move on, folks. We've got to. All right. The issue between Pope Innocent III and King John was over the issue of appointing the Archbishop of Canterbury. King John said, "My father appointed the Archbishop, so I should too." The Pope said, "No, I'm Pope and I'm going to appoint it." And John had to back down and accept the Pope's choice for the Archbishop of Canterbury.